Okay, good morning and welcome to this, the 14th meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee for 2013. This is the first time the committee meeting that has been held in the debating chamber since we moved to the Holyrood building. I did raise complaints about this at the conveners group, and I would just like to put on the record I consider this to be completely unacceptable. I just don't think it's suitable for the witnesses, and I don't believe that this format is conducive to having the type of discussion we would normally have at a committee meeting. So I'm only putting on the record what I've already complained to the parliamentary authorities about before we got here. Could I ask though that everyone follows the normal procedures and switch off the mobile phones and electronic devices? And we go straight to our agenda item this morning. It's the only one that's on our agenda. It's to take evidence from the Expert Working Group on Welfare and Constitutional Reform, and I'd like to welcome 3 members of the expert group: Lynn Williams, Policy Officer SCVO, Martin Evans, Chief Executive Officer, Carnegie UK Trust, and Mike Brewer, Research Fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Professor of Economics, ISER, University of Essex. And they are supported by Merlin Kemp, Secretariat to the Expert Working Group on Welfare and the Team Leader of the Welfare and Constitutional Reform Team in the Scottish Government, and Susan Anton, an economist and a welfare analysis for the Scottish Government. I understand that Martin Evans is going to make an opening statement, so I'll pass straight over to you, Martin. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for the invitation to give evidence to the committee. I have been asked to make a few minutes of an opening statement to explain the first phase of the expert working group and outline our findings, and then give the remit of the second phase of the expert group. I now chair the second phase of the expert working group and was a member of the first, which was chaired by Dara Singh. The remit of the first expert working group was to review and provide assurance on the work undertaken by the Scottish Government on, firstly, the cost of working age benefit payments in an independent Scotland up to 2017-18, and secondly, to look at the delivery of those payments in an independent Scotland. We are asked also to offer our views on immediate priorities for change in the welfare system following any vote for independence. The expert working group, I would like to emphasise, operated completely independent of the Scottish Government, and fulfilling our remit, we made our own decisions about which aspects of the Scottish Government's calculations we would comment on in our final report. The 5 members of the working group were people with expertise in public sector delivery, social policy, accountancy and economics. As I said, Dara Singh from Ernst & Young was our chair. Douglas Griffin, who was an ex-director of finance at Greater Glasgow Health Board, was on the board. Mike Brewer from the University of Essex, Lynn Williams from SCVO, and myself. The group issued a call to evidence to seek external views on the issues on the cost of welfare, delivery options and priorities for change. And the call for evidence set out a series of questions closely related to our remit, and the responses were independently assessed and published with our report. In addition, we held sessions with business representatives, the third sector, and the Poverty Alliance facilitated a meeting with benefit claimants, as well as independent input from local authorities. Turning to the substantive issues, the current UK fiscal framework does not produce detailed inter-country or inter-regional fiscal accounts or projections. Therefore, the forecasts were produced mainly by combining UK-wide or GB-wide forecasts of spending on individual benefits with historic data on the ratio of benefit spending in Scotland to the rest of the United Kingdom. We were very open in our report about the assumptions that we made, that had to be made, where there was a lack of specific data. We concluded that these preliminary forecasts by the Scottish Government were a reasonable estimate of the cost of benefit spending and related administrative costs over the period to 2018, given the information currently available to the Scottish Government. We said that these forecasts could be improved if the Office for Budget Responsibility produced economic forecasts for each region of the United Kingdom, if the Scottish Government had access to data and models owned by the DWP, or if the DWP and the Inland HMRC would undertake a bespoke forecast of tax and benefit credit spending in Scotland. We said that there would be an advantage to both the UK Government and the Scottish Government if accurate forecasts of benefit spending in Scotland were regularly prepared and published irrespective of the result of the referendum. The second main point of our remit, the delivery of benefits post-independence, we found, amongst other things, that all claims from people living in Scotland for job seekers allowance, employment and support allowance, income support and incapacity benefit were processed in Scotland. However, 40% of all claims processed in Scotland were claims made by people in England. In other words, we had self-sufficiency in delivery to Scottish claimants, but the UK government relied on Scottish-based staff for a significant amount of delivery. In the light of this, we concluded that given the very significant role that Scotland currently plays in delivering benefits to claimants in the rest of the United Kingdom, it is and it would be in the interest of both the Scottish and the UK government to work together during any initial transition period. The Scottish and UK governments have a common interest in working together to support each other, maintaining the delivery of benefit payments during an agreed but short period of transition. The group believes that this option will offer the best possibility of minimising disruption for benefit recipients, which is our main option appraisal criteria. In the event of independence, accommodating changes through an agreed transition period was considered feasible based on our review of the Northern Ireland experience, as it would allow some distinctive early policy and operational decisions to be taken. Ensuring flexibility would allow government of an independent Scotland to set the initial direction of a new welfare state as they assume progressively greater and then full control of the delivery of the system of benefits payments. Finally, we took strong and very moving testimony from those directly involved in the welfare system and concluded in our report there was a clear appetite across Scotland for a wider conversation about the principles and policies, opportunities and choices of welfare reform. The group concluded that the Scottish Government should give this work time it needs to allow the broadest possible audience the chance to consider the principles and the values and policy objectives an independent welfare state would be underpinned by. And this they have done through the second group, which I have been asked to chair. Very briefly, the second working group has only recently been formed, and we are going to consider the medium and longer term policy and delivery options of a welfare system in an independent Scotland. We've just issued a call to evidence which will run until December, and we explore the principles, as I said, and the type of policy propositions that would underpin a welfare system in an independent Scotland. Our first report confirmed that the Scottish Government's methodology to forecast the cost of benefits was reasonable, and the Scottish Government has committed to extend those forecasts so they cover the early years of the first Parliament of an independent Scotland, and we'll be using those in our own work. We'll also look at the longer-term options for delivery of benefit payments and the associated welfare services which are currently reserved. We would want to give an indication of the opportunities for bringing together devolved and reserved services in an independent Scotland to create a more holistic system of welfare. We plan to deliver the second phase of the expert working group's report in the spring of 2014. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Martin. I'll go to the committee to see if there's anyone who wants to ask a question. Jamie, do you want to kick off?
Thanks. Thank you very much, Convener, and welcome to you all in this rather unusual setting for a committee session. Thank you too for the work you've done thus far. It's been very interesting reading through the report that you've prepared for the Scottish Government. In your paper, the one you've published after the first phase of the group's work, at 3.4 of your report, you set out the Scottish Government's perspective in terms of expenditure on social protection, and I think later on you set out that essentially, using their methodology, the information they've got available to them, that this is a correct assumption. I just wonder if you could expand a little on that and set out if that's the case.
I'm going to ask Mike to answer the question in slightly more detail because he's our economist, but we did look at their assumptions and we tested them. And we tried to make quite clear in the report where there wasn't detailed figures what assumptions were made and what the possibilities of variance would be because of those assumptions. But if I ask Mike just to expand on the question you asked us.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, the bottom line is we believe that the forecasts set out in the report are a reasonable estimate of the costs, given the information currently available to the Scottish Government. I'm used to thinking about welfare policy at the Great Britain or UK level, and in doing that, and I talk to officials in London, they have more data and more models available to them than the officials in Edinburgh. And if the officials here or a future government had more data, then perhaps these estimates could be refined. But given the information available, we thought these were a reasonable estimate. Now, do you want to talk a little bit about where they come from? Essentially, the officials have been combining forecasts produced by the Office of Budget Responsibility and the DWP about what welfare spending in the UK will be like over the next 5 years, and combining that with historical data about how spending in Scotland has differed from the rest of the UK on different benefits. No, that's fine.
And you do, though at 3.2 you do say they don't reflect any options available to future independent Scottish governments, but surely that's, and I think you make this point later in the report, I mean that's equally true of the options available to a future UK government. I think at 3.11 you make the point that there could be significant uncertainties relating to universal credit, the possibility of future changes to policy design and implementation, uncertainty over how benefit recipients will respond to the changes. So, you know, it may be true of a future independent Scottish government, but it's equally true in a UK context. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. The forecasts at the UK level produced by the OBR reflect the current position of the UK government, and so we had to work with those. It is, yes, it's entirely possible that in the budget 2014 next March that the Chancellor might announce further changes to welfare policy affecting the whole of the UK, and these would affect our forecasts. Similarly, we didn't think it was right to account for any options Independent Scotland might take. These are the baseline. You know, this is what would happen if no more policy changes were announced by the UK government, and this is what would happen if in the future Independent Scotland didn't make any changes to policy.
Could I add one thing to that 95% of expenditure relates to demand-led expenditure. So that's depending on what policies are in place and what response benefit claimants make to those policies. And what Mike is saying is we have assumed the status quo, as we understand it, is pushed forward up until 2018.
But I get, just to eke out that, I mean, again, how people will respond to whatever the framework is, it's the same in either context, presumably.
It's the same in either context, and I'll ask Mike to expand this point. What we didn't have access to was the DWP modelling of potential responses from benefit recipients. So they have, we understand, a reasonably sophisticated model which you could look at different ways that people might react to potential policies. We didn't have access to that. We wrote to DWP about that, and we recommended those kind of modelling were brought in, whatever happens with independence, to allow a Scottish Government to model future activities. But Mike is much more familiar with this technical side than I am. Yeah.
Did you request that model from the DWP to help inform your work?
We wrote, if I remember, we wrote to them asking, I don't think we could actually use it, but we wrote to them if it was available to the Scottish Government, and I can't remember the response, to be frank.
Something you requested for your own work?
Sorry.
It wasn't something you requested for your own work?
We didn't, I don't think we requested that we could do that modelling, because we didn't have the resources to actually operate the modelling.
I just wanted to clarify that at that point.
Is that right?
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Brewer, did you want to come back on that?
I think all the points I would have said have been made already. Sorry,
That's fine.
Okay. Turning to, I mean, obviously there's some issues made out about the suggestion, and the Scottish Government's response to it agrees it's a sensible suggestion that there should be some, in the event of a yes vote next year, I should say, there should be some form of transitionary arrangement whereby the delivery of benefit services are shared. But I just wanted to clarify is something that is set out in your report, that I think 4.68, you do say that all options are possible. That's the one you reached, that was the conclusion you reached, but other options are available and would be possible. Is that correct?
Yes, we set out on page 65 the option appraisal and the criteria we used and the options we considered, which were 7 options. And we had a long amount of discussion about these options. All are possible. Some have higher and some have lower risk, and that was the issue. And I think, and I'll ask Lynn to have a comment about this, our driving concern, our first issue in terms of our option appraisal, was how certain were we that the benefits would be paid to the individuals during a transition period? We were very aware of the vulnerability on income side for the claimants during a period of transition. So we put quite a lot of emphasis at the beginning about this certainty. So to answer your question, all the options are possible. Some carry much higher risk than others. And the risk we were most concerned with was the risk of accurate and timely benefit payments during a period of transition. We were also concerned that any incoming Scottish Government in the event of independence could have some flexibility. That's why we mentioned the Northern Ireland model. But Lynn was strongly involved in this option appraisal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that when we began to look at that transition period, we looked at a range of options, as you can see outlined in the report. So, for example, could we transfer powers to existing bodies? Looking at did you outsource to private providers? Looking at did we use the Northern Ireland Benefit Agency as well? I think primarily for that transition period, what was important is a number of things, as Martin outlined, that for those who are claiming benefits, the clear priority is that stability is there. And people ask questions about what will happen in the event of a yes vote, is that they're concerned that they don't lose out financially. So primarily from our perspective, and from my perspective, is that certainty is there, that for that transition period, people know what will happen and what they're entitled to. But also, during that transition period, you know, what is negotiated with the UK government should Scotland say yes? What options do we have, and increasingly what kind of flexibilities potentially could be negotiated as well to look at ironing out some of the issues that we picked up in the call for evidence quite strongly around what wasn't working well, some of the current changes. So from our perspective, that transition period is important, is that we have a twin track approach, is that for those however long that period lasts, is that security is there for benefit claimants, that if we can negotiate flexibilities that make people's experience better, but also at the same time, if there is planning towards a new approach to welfare in Scotland, that's a twin track approach there as well. But primarily, as Martin outlined, in all of our discussions, is what would be the safest bet or option for claimants, and then what could we do in terms of negotiating flexibilities around the current system while there's a transition period going on.
And Ms Williams talks about the, you know, for however long the transition arrangement might last. But I mean, I think it's fairly clear from your paper you're suggesting a fairly short period. You suggest in your paper either potentially tying it to the term of the current programme of welfare reform, which would be the end of 2017, or potentially on an anniversary of potential Independence Day, suggesting 2018 might be a possibility. Could you talk a little bit about that, why you think these dates might be sensible?
I think my recollection was I don't think we firmly pinned down what that would be in terms of, you know, and when the government responds. I mean, I think personally, you know, in terms of looking at how the current system is working, the experience, and part of my role in the group was to bring the experience of those who are currently undergoing the current changes, was to make sure that transition period is as short as we possibly can. But, you know, we have to be aware of practicalities and what's feasible in that period of time. So I know the government's response, I believe the paper response to our report was limited to 2 years. But I think we have to be practical, look at what's feasible in that period and what can be negotiated, but making sure at all times that those who are claiming are secure and safe.
Okay, I have other questions, but I'm aware of taking up some
Alex,
time.
you want to give a supplementary?
Ask you to expand a little bit on this transitional issue. When you look at the nature of the benefit system, for example, they're very closely tied together. And while it might make sense on first observation to suggest a gradual change, is it the case that many benefits would have to be transferred together and it would be difficult to make it gradual in some cases?
I think there's two things going on over this period. One is the benefit system itself is changing, that's universal credit, and secondly, the control over the benefits is changing potentially from a UK to an independent Scottish government. In order to make sense of how best that would work, we did this option appraisal, and I agree there are risks in here. What we are saying is from the evidence of Northern Ireland, you could run what is continuing to be a UK system of benefits but have amelioration during a short transition period, whilst you geared up to have a different, if you wanted a completely different system. I think our recognition was that in order to have a completely different welfare system, you need some time to build the systems, to actually train the staff, to find the software, and then to deliver them. I think what's behind your question is, could you do it sooner and could you do it as a one? We would say, from our option appraisal, you would be not wise to go immediately from 2016 to a completely independent welfare system. You need time to build that up. But I would also emphasise that there's a mutual interest from the UK government and the Scottish government to discuss this, because in Scotland there's a large number of benefits being delivered from Scotland to UK recipients. So there's a mutual interest in finding a reasonable solution.
You were essentially looking at working age benefits, but if we look at the broader benefit system structure, including pensions, for example, is there an opportunity there to identify areas which would have to be transferred together and areas which could be left at a different point? For instance, could we do working age benefits at one point and then do pensions at a different point?
I say, in principle, no reason why not, if they're separate. I think what would be difficult would be separate out individual working age benefits, because they have to be set now as one. But in terms of the possibility for the transition, I think everything should be on the table, because there's a mutual interest in the sensible outcome of that, in the interest of the citizens of the United Kingdom, whether they've run from the UK government to the rest of England, rest of the UK, or the Scottish government in an independent Scotland. So I think these are going to be difficult, but I would hope professional negotiations between people who have the interests of their citizens at heart. And I think the possibilities are fairly open, but we're saying you still need a transition period in order to do it effectively and not risk payments not being made to vulnerable benefit recipients, north and south of the border.
Yeah, but there will be complexities involved in the timing of specific benefits to avoid problems.
Oh, I think undoubtedly. I mean, what I said, the twin tracking of significant change up to 2018 on the current plans under universal credit adds a series of complexity to this, which you could well do without. So we don't know how that's going to roll out. The expectation fully rolled out by 2018, but some of the indications are it may not be fully rolled out by then, in which case there's another set of negotiations about how to take over an incomplete transition to universal credit and what an incoming Scottish government would like to do with welfare.
Thank you.
Okay, Ken McIntosh.
Thanks. Just on the same theme, but you've clearly emphasised at length how integrated the systems are. Am I right in thinking that there is no alternative Scottish system currently drawn up? You weren't able to look at a sort of alternative plan to the current UK system?
No, that's one of the functions of the expert group, is to kind of draw out what would be a Scottish welfare and social protection system. There is no blueprint that I've been made aware of. If there is, I hope it will come through our call for evidence, and we'll be able to have a look at that. We've got 3 months to look at alternative systems. I'm not aware of one. Let me just ask Mike.
There have been a couple of high-profile commitments, for example, to abolish the bedroom tax. How would you go about, we're trying to have a transitional period between the current UK system and a Scottish system. The UK system is moving towards universal credit and various other changes. How do you manage to negotiate out of particular benefits, such as the bedroom tax? How do you do it?
Well, I think that's a very good point. And how would you go about it? Well, with some difficulty, but the example we looked at was Northern Ireland, which have opt-outs from a variety. They run a UK benefit system under contract, but they have the power to opt out. And I understand they haven't yet implemented the legislation on the bedroom tax, for example, so that can't be implemented yet in Northern Ireland. They are not going to have the payments on a monthly basis. They're going to keep them at bi-weekly or weekly. They're going to continue with the system of being able to apply directly and not have to apply online. So There is currently an example of a system operated with under UK rules where there are opt-outs and amelioration. So because there is that evidence, I say it is possible to have that negotiation between the parties.
And it's a negotiation. So basically, the Northern Ireland system is agreed at a UK level. Is that right?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
The Northern Ireland system of opt-out is agreed by the UK government. Is that right?
Yes, as far as I understand, I'm going to take, as far as I understand it, the Northern Ireland have their own powers to operate a system. They choose to use the UK system in terms of software, but they can, because they are choosing to that, create their own additions and subtractions from the UK system, which is what we would envisage, what our first report envisaged in any transition period. That is, you wouldn't take it over on a big bang. You would have an agreed, and we are saying fairly short, and the Scottish Government is saying 2-year period of transition. During that period, for example, on the bedroom tax, Northern Ireland, on the Northern Ireland model, you could say, no, we're not going to have that aspect of your system or the system in how we're delivering it in Scotland. So in our view, it is possible to have a transition period as I've described. Can I just make sure I've got that right with my colleagues? Yeah.
As I understand it, yes, there are negotiations between the Northern Ireland Assembly government and the UK government about the bedroom tax, but as yet there's no agreement, so it's a hypothetical that you're talking about?
A lot of this is hypothetical, but what we're saying is under that system, there is that discussion going on about within a UK system where you control some aspects of it from a different jurisdiction, you can actually make variation in the UK system. So I think that was the question. Whether or not they're successful and what those distinctions are is a matter between the two governments.
Okay. Ken, you want to carry on?
Yeah, no, I think it's very difficult to get to the heart of this one. It's clearly, I think Lynn suggested earlier, the priority must be stability and security of payments to benefit to claimants. And so you want to guarantee that. At the same time, I'm trying to work out how you pick and choose which benefits you can continue at an integrated UK level and which ones you can opt out of. Sure, if it's a matter of negotiation, then it's not simply a matter for Scotland. It's a matter for both governments, and it's a matter of negotiation, and it's a matter of quite a deal of uncertainty, it strikes me.
The only point I would make on that is we looked briefly at the Edinburgh Agreement and the kind of goodwill approach that has been committed to on both sides. In the event of a vote for independence, we would say the Edinburgh Agreement kicks in. There'll be broadly a mutual agreement to be negotiated under goodwill. And in terms of the power play, we're saying look at who does what. Scotland's self-sufficient in its working age benefit delivery. England is not, and therefore there's a mutual interest in having these discussions. Whether they're successful does depend on the parties, how far they can negotiate what level of derogation from a universal system over a short period of time is both a matter of practicality, which I do agree with, but also in terms of the willingness of the parties to negotiate. But nothing that we saw said that this was an impossible situation. What we said was, in the event of a vote, where the incoming Scottish Government had control over welfare policy, we suggested a period of transition, and we didn't say you have to take it lock, stock and barrel over that period. We said you could negotiate, we think you could negotiate derogations, and we used the Northern Ireland example of that. And I think your point is, how successful would they be? That depends on the parties' ability to negotiate and willingness to negotiate.
Okay, Kevin next.
Thank you, Convener. I'm glad I wore my glasses today, or else I might have had some difficulties in seeing you guys. I would like to carry on with the Northern Ireland opt-out example, the derogations, as you have called it. In terms of the policy decisions that the Northern Ireland Assembly have taken thus far and are likely to take in the future, but let's deal with thus far. Have there been any difficulties at all in Northern Ireland over this period of making payments to people in need?
I'm not aware that we looked at that issue, but nobody said to us there was a difficulty, so I can't answer that definitively. Could you?
I couldn't either, no, I don't think so. I think this is from memory. I was at an event recently where there was representatives of Northern Ireland there. So one of there are obviously agreements they've made around direct payments to tenants, and also the weekly payments. But in terms of the bedroom tax, there has to be negotiation around how that works, because there'd have to be what they would call an admin fix at central level to deal with that. And from the Northern Ireland Assembly's approach, my understanding around the bedroom tax particularly was it made sense for them to find a way to ameliorate that, because it actually cost them more to deal with the impact of it. So the negotiations are ongoing. Like Martin, I'm not aware of any issues around payment or issues around risk to payment, because we didn't look at that in any detail. But there may be something we look at perhaps in stage 2 around, what works well in other areas and what doesn't.
And no one in Northern Ireland at this moment in time is paying bedroom tax.
Sorry?
No one in Northern Ireland at this moment in time is paying bedroom tax. Am I right in saying that? Yeah.
That's my understanding, yes.
Yeah. Obviously, that situation is somewhat different in the fact that welfare has been devolved to the Northern Ireland Assembly rather than here. But it looks like, and I'm sure that you will look at this, that in terms of benefit payments to those in need, there's been no difficulty in Northern Ireland that has sprung up to your committee thus far.
And I think it's a fair point, is that we will look at, how that has worked. And it makes sense to look at, in terms of the transition period, if there's a transition period in Scotland, is if things have worked relatively well in Northern Ireland, what can we learn from that experience? So it would make sense to look at that, I would say.
I go back to the point about the current situation where a number of the benefits UK-wide are dealt with here in Scotland. It would be fair to say, I would imagine that it would be in the interests, you talked about goodwill, Mr Evans, but it would be in the interests of the rest of the UK government to come to a transition deal to make sure that benefit recipients south of the border continue to be paid as well, if their benefit is administered here from Scotland.
I would say yes. I've worked in this area in Scotland for about 30 years, and I was surprised at the degree of integration in the delivery of benefit system, which are delivered to recipients outside Scotland from within Scotland. So if I'm surprised at that, other people may well be surprised at that. But the consequence of that is there's a mutual interest, is what I'm saying I'm agreeing with you, between the two governments, if there was goodwill to have any transition period dealt with in a sensible way, because they both governments have an interest in protecting the interests of their vulnerable citizens in this.
So common sense, logic, gumption, whatever you want to call it, should come into play here in terms of dealing with this during the course of that transition period.
I think that would be the view of our committee, yes, on all reasonable grounds, given the Edinburgh Agreement, given the goodwill that is predicted in there. In the event of a vote for independence, good common sense and goodwill should prevail, as you're saying.
Thank you. Convener, I have some other questions. I don't know if you want me to move on to that or continue on this issue.
Annabelle wanted to come in as a supplementary on this.
Thank you, Convener. I was actually going to raise a number of the issues raised by my colleague Kevin Stewart, so I won't duplicate matters. But just, I think one point perhaps in this discussion, perhaps from the political side of the debate, has been missed, which is that it's a matter of simple democracy. If Scotland votes yes, Scotland has voted inter alia for the Scottish Government to resume take control over the welfare system. And therefore everything flows from that, including very sensible points made to the effect that each government would be, it would be presumed that each government, including therefore the Westminster government, would act in the interests of their respective citizens. And that, I think, those two key issues inform everything that would flow thereafter. Thank you, Convener.
I don't think that was a question.
Alex,
you wanted to.
Yeah, it was just you've talked a lot about goodwill and understanding during the transitional process, and I believe that would be there. I don't think there's an issue with that. But I wonder how that might operate the practicalities of that. Would it be necessary, in order to ensure that there was continuity of payments, for there to be some kind of arrangement where credit notes are exchanged that are then included in the higher level negotiations about how the separation of the national finances will take place?
Well, Lynn's going to answer. We never looked at the technical side of transition and payments at all. So if Lynn has a view, I'll be interested to hear it.
I think we're doing a bit of crystal ball gazing there. I think it's difficult to say. I think, from memory serves me, in the report, we do begin to look at elements of a potential service level agreement, the kind of areas that would need to be discussed at that negotiation level. To get to the level that you're talking about in terms of credit notes or how that is probably looking a bit too far to the future. But I think in the report we did begin to outline what might those negotiations begin to look like, what are the factors we need to look at, for example, how IT systems operate, who would do what would continue in terms of the integration that we have, in terms of Ken's point about what flexibilities might we begin to negotiate as well. So we did begin to pad some of that out to a certain extent. I think it was in chapter 4, if memory serves me well. Yeah.
May I come in, convener? You know, as it stands, Scottish civil servants are providing services to the rest of the UK which exceed the services provided by the rest of the UK to Scotland. And we did conceive, it's on paragraph 4.74, we did conceive that it's possible that there could be financial payments for these services. In other words, the rest of the UK might be paying the Scottish Government to continue administering pensions for English pensioners, and it's conceivable that the rest of the UK could charge the Scottish Government for administering some benefits for Scottish benefit recipients in the short run, you know, whilst there is this untangling. So that definitely is an option. We're
all very hopeful that these kind of things never happen, but if you look at what's happening in the United States today, you can see that government can shut down. My concern is to ensure that we're never in a position where there is a question over who pays the benefits, and should we ever be in that position, that there's a system in place that will allow the Treasury, for example, to go on paying, even in the event of doubt, knowing that it will be taken into account at a higher level and dealt with?
Well, we think that these arrangements would need to be negotiated over, and there would have to be an agreement. We hope that both governments would negotiate responsibly and sensibly with the interests of their citizens at heart, and following the principles that Annabel Ewing set out. The people have voted for a separate government, but there is a mutual need for all benefit recipients in the UK to receive their benefits. So we hope that both parties would negotiate sensibly.
We set out in paragraph 4.74 the principles, the main provisions of any intergovernment agreement. We haven't set out the details and the transactions, but we set out those which are covered by your question there: transitional payments, swapping payments, contracting. So they're all set out in several bullet points under 4.74.
I think, sorry, can I give it? Perhaps we have more faith in politicians than you have in yourself, Alex. I don't know. I said perhaps we have more faith in politicians than you have yourself, but I think, we would be hopeful those agreements would be, discussions would be professional and keep at heart the fact that people at the end of the day, who's at the end of the system, is people who are vulnerable, who are in work relying on benefits. So for us and for those at the end of the system who rely on benefits to live day to day, it makes common sense from our perspective.
I think self-doubt's an important quality in every politician.
Can you want to come back?
Just one thing. We did identify in our report a weakness in terms of the strategic grip on this issue, because the strategic leadership is based in a DWP and we don't have that expertise in Scotland. So that's one of the things that we would just emphasise in our report. We have to build that capacity. There's a small number of people required, but if you're going to move into an independent welfare system, you do need, within the civil service or an agency, the kind of understanding and policy breadth that the system brigades into the headquarters in London. So that was that's another issue to bear in mind in terms of the transition, to find those people and place them within Scotland.
Linda.
I just think you hold on to that thought, Lynn. Just to to finish this wee bit for me, convener, before I move on to another aspect, if that's okay. It just struck me in the discussion, you know, the fact that all claims for Scotland are processed in Scotland. Does that actually make it easier for a Scottish-only system to move forward in terms of the practicalities and the admin?
Well, can I as I said, it was I had never looked at the delivery of benefits, and so personally it was a surprise to me. I think by having that, it makes then the discussions that we were asked to have a look at, transition of delivery, it makes it a lot more straightforward in terms of the interests that you are trying to apply here. Because, of course, if you have a 100% of working age benefits broadly delivered in Scotland by Scottish civil servants, and they also deliver a range of benefits to English, and I think it's broadly English claimants, well, it makes the transition a lot more understandable and slightly more straightforward because you have the cards in Scotland. So if it wasn't like that, I think we would be having we would have emphasised the transition might be more difficult to negotiate. I mean, I still think it will be difficult to negotiate, but I think holding all those delivery people in Scotland to Scottish citizens means that you can be assured of you could have a greater degree of assurance about the certainty of the transition period than you would otherwise have had. Can I just ask Mike, because Mike was also raising this, that's
yes, that's absolutely right, yes. And we must also not forget about the HMRC benefits, where we actually had less information. So HMRC were not as able to break down how their UK operations are split between Scotland and the rest of the UK. But you're absolutely right for the DWP benefits, yes, that Scotland does not rely on the rest of the UK for processing Scottish benefit claims.
Yeah, that leads me neatly on to my next point, actually. Thank you, Mike. I was interested in looking at the evidence that had come in from across the board, from business as well as from the other groups that you spoke to. There was quite a lot of parallels, and the one that really jumped out at me is something that some of us have been talking about for a long time. Questions like, why can't it be better joined up? The tax system's too complicated. We should be combining social care and welfare, NHS social services. One group talked about genuine partnership, and the business group talked about needing a more coordinated approach. And they both groups then went on to saying that a taxation debate was also required. So it's not just about benefits, it's about taxation too. And the business group were very upfront in stating that the current taxation system works against people with low incomes, which then brought me on to the remit of the second group that you're chairing, Martin, which is about opportunities for bringing devolved and reserved services together to create a more holistic system of welfare. And I wondered if within that remit you would be looking at the taxation system too, in that, as we currently are, some benefits are in fact delivered through the taxation system.
As part of our remit in the second group, which you say, as you rightly say, I'm chairing, we do have a cost remit. We have to look at costs, and if we can, we have to look at, if we're making a suggestion for more expenditure, we have to look at where that cost might come from, either savings in the system or from the taxpayer. So we're very early days yet, but we are very aware that this is a balanced issue. We haven't been set to say, could we create the perfect system irrespective of cost? We've been asked to say, within the current cost constraints, or the cost extrapolated through the life of the next Parliament, what would be a welfare system? And if you were to make changes to it, where would you make savings if you were going to increase the costs, or where would you and how would you raise, and what kind of taxation would come? Now, as I said, that's very early days, and I think it's quite heroic that we've accepted that remit. But I think it's only right that if we're going to look at this issue, we look at it on this balanced approach. We can't just say, here's perfection, and that's what it would look like. We have to say, here's what it may cost, and that will be a challenge for the people giving us evidence too.
Can I think We're not going to do a review of the personal tax system in the second group, but if issues are raised about the tax system and how that relates to welfare delivery, then we will discuss them. In my opinion is that when universal credit is finally implemented, the tax system will have much less of a role in delivering welfare than it used to. And effectively, it's going to be all run by DWP, and there isn't really much role for the tax system. The fact that the personal allowance keeps on rising is taking more and more welfare recipients out of taxation rates. So I think they're becoming more separate. But the integration or lack of integration between the welfare system and things like social care, as you mentioned, or housing, or other functions of local government, I absolutely think that the group will definitely look at that, and there are definitely opportunities to discuss how to do things differently in an independent Scotland there. And I'm quite excited about those discussions.
Yeah, and Lynn, from a practitioner's point of view, I presume that's something that came across very strongly to you as well.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think going back to your original question, Linda, one of the things that we probably need to look at is looking at the balance of cash benefits versus types of services. And you know, in other models in Scandinavia and elsewhere, there's more of a balance towards services as opposed to cash benefits. So that's the kind of thing I think we might begin to delve into, is that kind of area. From a practical perspective, from the position of people who are at the receiving end of services, myself as a carer, but also just generally is how do we cut through the complexity of not just the reserved benefits but also devolved services as well. So within the discussions we have here and over the next year of the debate is begin to cut through how do we make the experience of people better so that they're not having to deal with masses of bureaucracy to get to the one service which actually holds a family together. And so there's an opportunity, as Mike says, to begin to look at how you begin to bring together social care, for example, and the benefit system. How do you deal with things like education, support for disabled children? There are lots of opportunities here, I think, and not to miss the chances we have to begin to debate those issues in real terms. What came out strongly from my own experience as a carer, but within the evidence sessions we had, was that how these systems, reserved and devolved, bang together in a way that actually prevents people from being in work. So people are moved into dependency, not through choice. One of the carers who spoke very eloquently at the Poverty Alliance session said, I want to work. But social care doesn't let me do that in Scotland. And as a carer, the carer's allowance is the lowest income replacement benefit we have. So because of the choice I'm forced to make, I'm now in poverty. You know, but people do want to be in work. So how do we begin to bring those systems together more effectively? So if you, as a carer, want to continue working, you can do that. The other element is around the role of employers, which we haven't really looked at yet. And at our first discussion, we began to look at, how do employers fit into a wider welfare system? So in terms of things like flexible working practices, given the change in family structures we have in the UK, the fact that people have dual caring roles, for example, are looking after elderly parents and disabled children. So the role of employers, both in terms of occupational welfare, but also in terms of how they flexibly support the changing life patterns we have.
Interested to see how strongly in the business forum you have that some of these ideas were coming forward from business people in terms of how they could assist employees in so many different ways. So I found it very hopeful. Thank you, Convener.
Commentary from Alex.
Yeah, when Linda asked her question, I thought she was going to raise the issue of tax credits, and when she didn't, I thought I'd better. Have you looked at the role of tax credits within the system of support for those on working age benefits, and have you considered how the impact of a transitional phase on tax credits may impact on the transfer of benefits?
In Martin's earlier comments, he noted that under current plans, universal credit should be fully implemented by 2018, and we sort of used that assumption. In other words, we were sort of looking ahead to a world where there weren't any tax credits. This transitional period we were talking about would be the one in which universal credit would finally be rolled out, and so a future independent Scotland wouldn't have to worry about tax credits. But Martin also said earlier that if universal credit rollout is delayed, then that does make the transition much more complicated.
Well, and it does seem to be slipping a bit.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, the government announced an ambitious timescale for bringing in such a dramatic change, and they're behind, at the moment, but they continue to state that they are committed to having it fully operational by 2017.
Okay, I was going to ask a couple of questions myself before I go on to other colleagues who want to come back in. But it is based on some of the information that you've given us earlier. You've said that your report is scheduled to be completed by spring next year. Will that be a fully costed report?
Will it be we are tasked, if I remember rightly, to if I can just find the kind of form of words rather than me kind of remember it offhand. With that financial baseline, that is extrapolating from the data the first group said was an accurate forecast of benefit expenditure, extended through the life of the next Parliament, is what the Scottish Government's agreed to do. With that financial baseline in mind and being mindful of the economic and fiscal circumstances, the group will consider the broad costs and savings which might arise from our policy positions on working age benefits and how, where such costs might be met and such savings invested. So I take that as, if it's not fully costed, it's certainly a very clear indication of net cost, where the income might come from and where the savings might come. I think that's the implication I would take from our remit. Convener.
Reference was made earlier to, I know you've just specified there, working age benefits, but there has been an announcement from the Scottish Government in relation to pensions. Has that had any implications, given that there's commitments to the triple lock and to a minimum pension? Have those considerations been factored in, given that you said that you were working on the OBR and DWP figures for the present time, and as you projected forward, you were looking at the status quo? Has that had any impact at all on your considerations and costings?
I'm going to ask Mike to say something about the demographics, because we did discuss that, but we are quite clearly limited in our remit, rightly in my view, to working age benefits. That's what we addressed, but we did address some of that point about demographics because it came up in the IFS paper as well over our period.
Yes, I mean the long run demographic position is quite frankly not particularly relevant for the timescale we were looking at, and even if we extended into the early years of an independent Scottish government, it still wouldn't be relevant, quite frankly. There are long-term demographic issues challenging most European countries, and Scotland would be no different. But the remit for the second group is to look at working age welfare. So that's what we will do.
Michael, in the call for evidence, I think we'll pick up there are transition periods there. So, for example, for a young person transitioning from school to beyond, and then obviously people transitioning from a carer's perspective, for example, if you transition towards pension age. And I think as a group we'll have to look at those transitions. But we haven't yet got into the kind of detail you're talking about how that might impact in terms of the commitment the government has made. So we've only met once, it's very, very early stages. But I think as a group we will have to look at how these things interlock and work together.
Okay. You've also indicated that you've taken into account that Scotland could administer its own welfare system because it currently administers its own plus a bit for England. That being the case, have you factored in that if the welfare system in Scotland was only administered in Scotland, it would require a smaller workforce?
If I can make one point firstly, the workforce delivering benefits has been declining through the UK, about 20% decline in the last few years. So there has been a trend of declining number in the workforce. Before I ask Mike to have a quick word about this, when we looked at the numbers delivering, the vast majority were on customer-facing. So we imagine they will carry on doing that work on customer-facing benefits in Scotland. Of the 11,000 odd, the vast majority. Because an independent Scottish Government will be taking on more responsibilities, I don't see they would need less staff myself. They'd need more, in my view. But Mike is more expert in this than I am.
Well, I'm sure, but no, I think you're right, Convener. Yeah, I mean, we have identified, because Scotland is self-sufficient plus more administering benefits, I think you are right that there are therefore more staff than will be needed to administer Scottish benefits. But what we imagine, first of all, the vast majority of DWP staff are in customer-facing roles. So we're talking about maybe around 1,000 who are doing benefit processing. So it is a small fraction of 1,000 who you might think of as being not needed. Secondly, in this transition period we outline, these staff would be used continuing to administer benefits for people in England. So we're talking about it, because there is a transitional period that we've outlined, there is time for staff to be redeployed. And thirdly, if you look across all the things that the independent Scottish Government do, there will almost certainly be areas where the Scottish Government needs to put in more staff than it currently has. This is one of the areas where it has more staff than it might need in the long run.
Have you taken into account then economies of scale?
Or rather the opposite. So in other words, that it might be less efficient to run benefits in a smaller country. We noted the possibility somewhere, but our estimate of the cost of welfare does include the cost of delivering benefits, but that's a very small fraction of the total cost, and small changes are not going to affect our broad conclusions of the 18-19 billion pounds of spending a year. But no, I certainly concede it's an area where we know very little. DWP are not used to thinking about how their functions are split between Scotland and the rest of the UK, so we had very little evidence to go on.
If I could just make that on table 3.5, we do set out in real terms the cost of delivering welfare benefits in Scotland over the period, and it is very marginally reducing over the 5-year period from £0.7 billion to £0.6 billion. So even over the period we're looking at, there's a reduction in expenditure on delivery.
Okay. I'll come back to people who've been in before. Jamie, you want to come back in again?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I want to focus on the next stage of work. Linda's asked some of the questions I was thinking of asking myself, but nonetheless, I think there's still some useful questions to be asked. So, in terms of the work you've engaged in thus far, it's clear from the introduction to the report that was published from the first stage that that was designed to help the Scottish Government prepare for the White Paper, which we know is coming shortly. The second phase of work is clearly designed to help the Scottish Government devise a policy in terms of the delivery of a benefits system. But in terms of the work you did, it's clear there's a lot of engagement with the third sector and interested parties. There was obviously drawing on the expertise of the Scottish Government and the UK government agencies that you were looking to contact, the DWP being the primary one, and you also undertook some meetings with the sector. So really, I suppose the question is, what type of activity are you planning this time round? Is it going to be sort of same type of thing?
I think we are planning to step up the engagement with people in terms of this discussion. We've issued our call for evidence. We're about to approve our process of engagement, which will be both offering third-party organisations some support to bring their members together. It will be structured focus groups in various parties which might be hard to reach, so we will go out and with the Civil Service engage in a series of structured focus groups. I, as the convener, will be inviting a number of people to come and speak to me privately in groups about this, and we're broadly issuing challenges to the people like academics and policy community to say, engage in this process and tell us within a structured call for evidence what you would say. We will send the convener and the committee our process which of our evidence support mechanism when we've concluded it, I hope in a week or two's time, and that will give you the detail. But I would say it's a step change from what we did previously, because this is even more, we need to be sure we have the widest range of interest represented in terms of looking at the future of a welfare system in Scotland.
Again, we will get the broad outline of the work that you're planning.
We'll send it, absolutely we'll send it to you. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sure we look forward to it. I think that's all we need to ask at this stage.
Kevin.
Thank you, Convener. I certainly welcome what Mr Evans has said there, and I would hope that the group would also look at some of the evidence that we have gathered during the course of our work to maybe get an insight into some of the difficulties that exist. One of the things which it says that you will do will be to look at how such policies would support people who can work into sustained employment. I think, Convener, if we go back to one of the Your Say sessions, we had a gentleman from Dundee whose son had Asperger's, who was working, who worked split shifts, but also had some benefit reliance as well. And their great fear was that he may be forced out of work and become entirely reliant on benefits, which, of course, would have scuppered his independence and probably done a huge amount of damage. One of the things which I would be interested in is if you could look at cases such as that we have come across in the Your Say sessions, and beyond that, reach out to groups such as Values into Action Scotland, who are very, very good at helping folk with learning disabilities into work. And I think that, you know, in terms of tailored policy to ensure that people who can work, sometimes unusual shift patterns and all of the rest, can do so. So I hope that you'll look at what we've done, and beyond that, look at the expertise of these kind of groups.
Well, absolutely. I've been very impressed by the testimony given to your committee, and very moved by it too. And we'll definitely take that into account. We're making, as I said, steps to bring our own testimony, and also to challenge people to say, well, it's not just describing what's wrong with the system. Can you positively say how you could improve it, which I think is a far more difficult task. But I do agree, if we don't absolutely have the heart, the difficulties and struggles that people who are currently within the system are facing, we won't actually apply ourselves as well as we could do. So I'm committed to having that wide range of engagement, and I've seen almost all your testimony to your committee as well. Lynn wanted to have
I think and we use the word co-production a lot, and from my perspective as someone who is there to represent the views of different people who are part of the system and who feel very isolated sometimes in this debate, this is the one opportunity we have to bring people's experience into creating what a future welfare state might look like, and or, you know, in the event of a no vote, what else could be changed. We have to look at all possibilities here. And I firmly believe, and from the sessions we had before, from speaking to families across Scotland, that sometimes the solutions are simple solutions. And from the Poverty Alliance session, what was quite clear from those who are currently going through work capability assessments, who are struggling with the current system, are things like culture, about communication, is the kind of things we struggle with generally in policy terms, is that how the systems operate and actually maybe marginalise people, so the sanction issues and so on as well. So from my perspective, we won't have done our job properly unless we actually do what you're suggesting, Kevin, and go out and speak to different groups, including those with autism. Particularly, there are challenges there around people who are older and now in work. From the carers' perspective, from those with disabilities. And certainly I know that I and officials already have had approaches from charities to offer to do sessions with the group as well. So for me, that experience will necessarily shape some of the principles around the welfare state, but also I believe some firm policy suggestions as well.
Very welcome. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, Ken McIntosh. Thanks.
Just picking up on that point, actually, that's one of the difficulties we have is trying to separate out maybe I would describe it as a shared agenda for welfare reform, a relatively well-shared agenda, and the idea of using independence as a vehicle to implement that change, which clearly there's a lot of disagreement about. Lynn just said there that you have to look at all the possibilities, including the event of a no vote. So if you just take the one benefit at the moment, which I think is the only specific one that we know the Scottish Government have a view on, which is the bedroom tax. Did you make a comparison between what you could do now, the costs and the change of what you could do now, using the powers you've got now to get rid of the bedroom tax in Scotland, and how quickly that would happen, compared to what would happen? Because, as I understand it, none of these changes to ameliorate or get rid of the bedroom tax can happen until after 2016, and then possibly not until 2 years after that. By which point, as I understand it as well, the bedroom tax will be totally in place in Scotland. So I'm trying to work out what is the difference. You know, at that point, do you unpick the bedroom tax, do you reverse and go back to the old payment system? And have you worked out the costs of that compared to just introducing a system now where you get rid of the bedroom tax?
We certainly didn't work out the costs of, as you're suggesting. of what the bedroom tax going in or out would be. I don't think it'd be that difficult to work out. In terms of principle, what we...
Are you working out what it will cost in 2016 or 2018, or what are you doing?
Well, I'm going to ask Mike to supplement my answer, but as far as I understand the system, what we looked at was the benefits as they currently are, system as they're applied, using forecasts up to 2018 and a Scottish proportion of those. We looked at that in the round. Although we looked at housing benefit, we didn't look at specific parts of the housing benefit up and down. Would that be right, Mike?
Absolutely not. Yes, that is right. We have not come up with our own estimate of what it would cost the Scottish Government to reverse the bedroom tax. We were producing a forecast of the cost of welfare in Scotland from now until 2016, and we'll extend that to 2018, and that will be done on the basis of stated UK government policy. And I think that because that's the sensible baseline to start with. It should, though, be possible. It must be possible to come up with an estimate of what it would cost the Scottish Government to not introduce the bedroom tax or to reverse the bedroom tax in the future, if that's what it wanted to do.
Well, I'd just be interested to know in future work whether you'll look at that specifically. But just on the practical point, are you working? I mean, are you working the assumption that you will unpick the bedroom tax? In other words, by 2016, you said earlier, Mr. Brewer, that you're using the assumption that universal credit will be in place by 2018. Now, I'm assuming that you're using the assumption that the bedroom tax will be in place by 2016. So I'm just trying to work out practically, are you going to then reintroduce payments for people that are no longer getting paid for spare rooms, or people who have moved properties? What is your assumption at this point? Is it a practical possibility? Is it a theoretical one? What's going to happen?
Well, the first time round, we produced a forecast of the cost of welfare, which assumed that universal credit would be fully implemented, and which assumed that the bedroom tax would be introduced throughout the UK. Now, when we come to revise those forecasts, we all want to look at what the UK government's policy position is, and we want to look at what the Scottish government's stated policy position is. Now, the Scottish government's stated position has changed since the group first started its work early in 2013. So when we come to finalise our report in the spring of 2014, we'll want to look at what the Scottish government's stated policy is on that. But at the moment, this is an area. At the moment, our starting point will be to produce a forecast of what welfare benefit spending will be in Scotland under the stated policy of the UK government, and that includes abolishing the... that includes, whatever you say, that includes reducing housing benefit payments where there is over-occupancy.
I appreciate what you're saying. It is difficult to get clarity from the Scottish Government about what their specific policies are, but just the assumptions that you are working on...
I don't think it is.
No, it's not.
Ken, if you want to ask your question.
I'm just trying to work out the practical assumptions. So the point is that bedroom tax is being introduced right now. You could argue that we could do something about it right now. The difficulty is I'm not quite sure what can we do about it in 2016. Never mind 2018, the 2-year interim period. What can we actually do about it in 2016? Are you working from the assumption that you will reverse and unpick all the changes that will have been made in 2016? Or are you talking about working with on the assumption that it's already in place? Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean,
no, I do, yes. The assumption that we make is this, and let my colleagues help me out as well on this one. In the event of a vote for independence from 2016, a Scottish Government would have the powers to do as it wished with a welfare system. And therefore, it could change the system from that date. What we're saying in terms of the transition, it would be a risk to do that as a whole. But there are elements of what I've called derogation, which you could do based on the Northern Irish experience. So you'd have the power to vary a UK system. You could actually introduce an entirely new system from 2016. We think that would be very high risk. So there'd be a period of transition using the example of Northern Ireland, and that example you gave about housing the bedroom tax, you could have a derogation from immediately from 2016 because you'd have the power to do so. You'd have to negotiate that and find the system fix, Lynn said, to do that, but that's not beyond the possibilities to do. So in terms of our thinking it is, until you have an independent Scottish Government with responsibility, our assumption is you work within the UK system. When you have it, there's a period of transition where you're working with the UK system for a period, and then you have the Scottish system. That's our assumption. Can I just check before you come back? That's broadly... Yeah.
Perhaps I'm being a bit pernickety here, but Mr. Bruce specifically said earlier that you're using the assumption that universal credit will be in place by 2018. So are you using the assumption that the bedroom tax will be fully in place by 2016 or 2018?
Yes.
Yes, it'll be fully in place.
Yeah. That's in terms of our costs, absolutely. Yeah.
Can I ask another question then, just about you're about to go on to make some estimate of the policy change, or the new look of a welfare system in Scotland. We know of the view of the Scottish Government on the current bedroom tax. We don't know what it will be in 2016, but we know what it is currently. Can I ask, do you have any guidance from the Scottish Government? Do you know of their view on any other of the changes that are being introduced by the Tory Government? In other words, have you got any guidance on any specific policy changes that you will follow, that you will implement, as it were, as part of your suggestions for a new system of welfare?
We haven't got any special insight into what the Scottish Government may or may not do. We've been asked to be an independent group to make an independent assessment, to bring evidence from third parties out there and come to our own view about that. If the Scottish Government wants to give us their view, we'll take that into account, but it will be no special view from the Scottish Government, and we'll arrive at our own assessment about what an independent welfare system for Scotland would be on the basis of the evidence given to us.
I appreciate that's very honest, and I can imagine, I hope you can imagine our frustration. The difficulty is you're doing a lot of work, but it's a principled work. It's not based on what's actually happening right now or what the government's saying right now.
I'm sorry, picking up Martin's point and picking up your own point, I think that looking ahead, we will necessarily have to look at, some of the forecasts are based on what we know just now. The evidence will almost certainly pick up on some of the issues that you are raising. We will have to look at how, for example, some of the responses in Scotland in terms of discretionary housing payments, how that's operating at a local authority level. No doubt the bedroom tax will be a key issue that we'll pick up. So I think we have to understand how the impact of that particular benefit change as part of a wider suite of benefit changes is impacted in Scotland as you begin to look forward and say, well, what will we need to, what's our starting point for a welfare system in Scotland? What's the starting point going to be? So that is only one element of that. So from my perspective, I would expect the evidence to begin to say to us, yeah, here is how it's working in Scotland, here's the impact of the bedroom tax in Scotland, and how do we respond to that in terms of the wider policy objectives that we would look at in terms of going forward. So we will have to look at what's happening there. I think we have to take that as a starting point, because it means that perhaps the starting point is necessarily worse than it might have been because of the impact of welfare reform in Scotland and elsewhere. But it's only one part of the picture, I think, in terms of other changes that are happening. But I would fully expect the evidence to begin to unpick, you know, that, for example, in terms of discretionary housing payments, as you will know, what's happening at local level is very, very mixed, and the response is very mixed. So we will almost certainly pick up some of that in the discussions we have.
I think in terms of our remit, I think we would attempt, if we were to say, here's an interim change and here's a more permanent change, we'll attempt to identify the cost of making those changes. And if they are costing more, where that income would come from. If they're costing less, where that saving might be apportioned to. So taking the specific example of the bedroom tax, there are estimates, I can't remember, about what that would cost. We would look within the context of our forecast of £17.6 billion on welfare in 2016. We'd look what proportion of mitigating or ameliorating that bedroom tax would be, and put that into the forecast, and so it would make a difference, not a huge percentage difference on a £17.6 billion payment, but it would make a difference, and therefore would be an expenditure an independent Scottish Government would have to find the tax revenue or the revenue to pay for. So our ambition would be to identify changes and the costs of those changes from 2016. And we would, I imagine, well, as a chair, I would attempt to try to say there's two phases to that, an interim period of transition and a completely independent welfare system. And we're going to try to do that, as I said earlier on, quite heroic in the time, but we're going to attempt to do that.
No, but just to absolutely clarify that, just using Lynn's words, your starting point is not opposition to the Tory welfare reforms now. Your starting point is to either 2016 or 2018 after most of these reforms have been implemented. I mean, that's the fundamental difference I've got here.
Well, our starting point is reality, is that we have the current benefit system is our starting point. What is the predicted expenditure on the current benefit system was the first phase, to try to identify that. Having identified that, we're now going on to say, given the reality, that's what people are currently receiving and expect to receive, on that baseline, how would you then change that? And I think that's not an unreasonable proposition, because we've only just started our work on what the changes should be. The first phase was, what are the current systems by the current government, a UK government responsible for welfare benefits, and extrapolating that to 2018. That's what we've done. The next phase is, well, how would you change that? If the evidence is we change it in this way and that way, what would that then cost? We would then adjust the costs of welfare, both in terms of the cost to claimants and the cost of delivery. And I hope by early 2014 you'll have that and we'll come back and you'll quiz us on that too.
Convener, I've got one more question.
Okay,
I'm conscious I've just hogged the questioning again.
Yeah, carry on, if you want to ask one more.
It was just simply, just on that costing, can I just ask, when you're working out the costs and the potential changes, will you look at the affordability? In other words, will you relate the overall, not just a proportion compared to the UK government, but compared to the working age population, income and so on in Scotland?
Can I ask Mike to deal with it as our economist on the affordability side?
Well, I think affordability is a broader political question, which you can only answer by looking at all the costs that a government, all the spending government makes, and all the tax revenues it wants to collect. So what we were asked to do was to be mindful of the costs and be mindful of the economic and fiscal constraints. In other words, we're not going to come and say that a welfare system for Scotland involves doubling expenditure on all welfare benefits. That would be unrealistic. So we're not going to pronounce on affordability no, because we think that's beyond our remit. We think that's a broader political question which requires you to look at all aspects of government spending and of the government's desire to raise taxes. But we are going to come out with recommendations mindful of the economic and fiscal circumstances and where we can with accurate costings attached. And we noted in our first report that in some cases the tools are not yet available to come up with accurate estimates of the cost in Scotland, which is something which is which needs to change over the next few years.
So,
Alex, you wanted to... Sorry, Martin, I was going to come to another question, but if you've got something else to add.
I just wanted to emphasise that point, that we're not trying to duck the question. What we're trying to say is, from our working group, we're going to try to present back into the public sphere what an aspiration for an independent Scotland's welfare system might look like and what it might cost. Whether that's affordable or not, to come back to your question, we would then say that's a matter for the political parties to make a decision in the run-up to an election and take that. And we're not trying to duck the question, we're just saying we are committed to be costing this properly. The affordability question, I think that's a matter for those who stand for election.
Okay, a supplementary from Alex before going to Annabelle.
Referring briefly to that transitional phase that we mentioned earlier, it looks increasingly, as you know, in relation to answers I received earlier and the ones that Ken received a moment or two ago, that we're looking at a transitional phase that will be in parallel to the run-through and the completion of the welfare reform programme. Is it essentially the case that we're talking about a situation where the bulk of the welfare reform programme will have been completed before there is any chance of Scotland taking over direct control of the welfare system?
We said in our first report that seemed sensible. In other words, it seemed advantageous to line up this transitional period with the welfare reforms. Because if you don't do that, then an independent Scotland would inherit a situation where universal credit is partially implemented and some of its recipients are on it and some of it are on the legacy benefit. So it just seemed sensible and cleaner for us to line those two up. But as we say, all options are on the table. And if you wanted, if an independent Scotland wanted to, it could stop the welfare reform process immediately on the day it took office. But there would be risks attached to that option.
Annabelle.
Just to pick up a couple of points, I mean, the kind of premise upon which we're all engaged today is that, of course, the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament does not have power over the welfare system further to the Scotland Act, and that really is kind of the kind of essence of our discussion this morning, and to suggest otherwise is entirely misleading. In terms also of the Scottish Government's stated position, I'm looking at a document published in June 2013, the Scottish Government's initial response to the Expert Working Group on Welfare report. And I see at paragraph 20 in page 9 that the Scottish Government states, since the Expert Working Group began, we have announced steps the current Scottish Government would take if it were the first government of an independent Scotland, i.e. the SNP Scottish Government. These include reversing the bedroom tax, that's fairly clear, getting rid of the bedroom tax, which we don't have power to do at the moment. The Scottish Government goes on to say in this document, already published in June of this year, amending universal credit in order to take housing benefit out of universal credit and restore it as a benefit that is paid direct to social landlords, move away from single household payments, giving claimants the ability to receive individual support, equalise the earnings disregard between first and second earners. And the Government goes on to say that these priorities chime, in paragraph 21, with much of what the Expert Working Group set out in their report as priorities identified through their call for evidence and wider stakeholder engagement. And picking up on the report itself, at paragraph 5.41 on page 82, reference is made to evidence on public attitudes to welfare in Scotland in comparison with the rest of the UK. The paragraph goes on to state the initial findings from Scottish Social Attitudes Survey 2012, that's the report referred to, in fact reports that a majority of Scots, 64%, are in favour of the Scottish Parliament being responsible for making the key decisions about welfare benefits. I think that just clarifies certain points that Ken McIntosh made, which were erroneous as far as I'm concerned, and these documents prove that to be the case. I actually wanted to pick up, and it was going back to a conversation we were kind of starting to have about the NICS report and the kind of underlying approach that will be taken, and it was very welcome indeed to hear already the indication that one of the starting points will be individuals' experiences, their life, what can make things better in terms of delivery of a welfare system in 21st century Scotland. And I was mindful in this respect of what was stated, I think very importantly, at paragraph 510 of the report at page 73. And the expert group was talking about what had come through very strongly in discussions was the importance of benefit recipients being treated with dignity and respect. And the report went on to say many people commented that some of the language currently used to describe claimants unfairly stigmatises all those who rely on benefits and provides a less than balanced view of the situation many people face and the factors which can lead them to claiming benefits. And I just wonder if we could hear a bit more about how the important issue of language in this very sensitive debate is going to be addressed in the work of the group going forward. Thank you, Convener.
Well, I'll just say a few words because Lynn has been very clearly leading on our work on this and will in the future. We were, as we said, moved by the testimony given to you as a committee and by the testimony given to us. What struck us as a group from all sorts of different experiences was the feeling that for many claimants that they felt disrespected and stigmatized, not just by some of the wider discourse in newspapers and elsewhere about them, but also within their communities. So what they were wanting to do was to find ways to be thought of rightly as active and contributing members of society. And many of them actually wished to do that, but found the system currently prevented them. The childcare costs weren't enough, or the payments in work weren't high enough. So there was a general feeling that people were wanting to make that contribution, wanting to be seen as positively, but were being prevented by system failures, as well as by some of the discourse around them. Now, we can't change the discourse around them, but what we can do is bring out the positive nature of how a benefit system can help people in transitions from non-work to work, how we can help people who have no opportunity to work, to feel valued and do other things. Already we've had discussions about the role of voluntary sector working, about community work and receiving a benefit. So what I'm hoping that we'll be able to do is to put a positive view about the contributions people can make to society, to be clear in many ways about responsibilities when you're receiving benefits, the conditionality of benefits, but also that conditionality throws both ways. That's from government to its citizens and citizens to the taxpayer. So we have this ambition to say something which reflects what we have been hearing so far about these issues of dignity and respect. And I know that Lynn has had a lot more experience with this than I have.
I think part of that will be, and actually if you go back to, I think it was Annabelle, the white paper around the road to the Constitution and the referendum that came out in February, there's a paragraph in that which talks about, to me, some of the principles that could underpin a welfare state, the idea of dignity and respect. As Martin said, and it came out so strongly, and I think again is the experience of people within the current system is sometimes very negative. Some of the changes people were asking for were not about necessarily about additional money, but about actually the language that's used around them. Some of you'll be aware of the increased use of sanctions amongst people as well. One of the things that STVO does is convene a third sector reference group, and from the experience that the case studies were gathering through that, is a case of one chap who'd been sanctioned and had no money to get to the job centre to sign on and had to walk on an empty stomach. Now, these are the extreme cases of what welfare reform means in reality. So when we look at developing the principles that we will report on next spring, for me, key elements, and that links back to whether there's a written constitution or not, is around the idea of being dignity and respect. The other element which all political parties are guilty of focusing on is the focus on unpaid work as being the goal of welfare. And we must recognise, and part of that will be around principles and discussions we've had already, is we have to recognise unpaid contributions to society and the economy, not least of these being unpaid care. So how do we value and reward better than we do things like unpaid caring in Scotland, which is worth £10 billion to the economy, but also elements of volunteering as well. So for me, that language will be set, the tone will be in those principles. And how do we value citizens no matter what their contribution is, and recognise the economic and social value of that. People with disabilities, for example, who maybe cannot work but contribute in many other ways. Again, how do we value that and not actually put them in a position where they can't afford to live and afford to buy the basics of life. So a lot of the call for evidence, I think, will pull some of that in from the Scottish Campaign on Welfare Reform. Charities like Inclusion Scotland and others have already begun to state what those principles might look like. And I think for many of us, these are things we would all agree with around the kind of experience we would want to have if we were part of that system. And the fact that we value different contributions to society, that paid work is not always a goal for all.
Thank you for that response from both Martin and from Lynn. Can I just say, Convener, how refreshing it is to see the nature of our debate here in Scotland compared with the debate that's going on at Westminster, which sadly does not meet the aspirations, in my view, of the key principles we've been discussing.
Okay, thanks, Annabelle. A couple of questions from myself, just to tidy things up from my point of view. Have you done any work, or has it been raised in any of the evidence that you've taken, the possibility that having a different benefit system, even in transition, would require benefit recipients to go through a new assessment at that point? Has that come up?
It came up in the initial call for evidence. Yeah, there was very strong views, particularly from disability charities, that they wouldn't want that to happen. So I think we have to be mindful of the fact that people are assessed to death. I think, in terms of, local, and perhaps one of the opportunities around, if there is an independent system, is begin to cut through some of that bureaucracy. So you have assessment for independent living fund, for self-directed support, potentially as integration moves in, you know, there's a whole lot of things people have to go through for benefits, for work capability assessment. So there's a sense that there's an opportunity to cut through some of that and make it easier for people. And certainly from my perspective, to have another assessment on top of that defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do here. So.
Yeah. And another question, I know that you said, Martin, and we're already aware of this, that some of the members of the first expert group are still on the phase 2 group, if that's what it's called. Have you looked back at the phase 1 report, and do you still stand by all of its contents, or have you had to revisit, in hindsight, some of the conclusions that you arrived at in the initial report?
Well, in our homework for appearing before you, Convener, we all were very careful to reread our report and go through it. And there's nothing that we read in that report before today's meeting that we would want to change. We would maybe want to improve some of our language in it, but it was we have none of our conclusions. Would we say to you, no, we got that wrong, or we've got more evidence now?
Okay, and again, given the timescales of what we're working to here, the Scottish Government's white paper is, I believe, due in the autumn, a very long period in which we could find it arriving. And your report could arrive in the spring, again, a lengthy period around which it could arrive or otherwise. But the one thing that we do know is that they're not going to come at the same time. So if the independence prospectus that the Scottish Government says we're going to get in the autumn of this year doesn't contain all of your costed analysis for the welfare element, is there not a welfare-shaped hole in the middle of the white paper?
You're going to lead us into difficult grounds here. As far as we're concerned, and the commitment that we've had from the Scottish Government, is they've said our first phase report will be fully integrated into their white paper, because that's the costings from the current system up to the foreseeable future, 2018, of a welfare system. And on that basis, that's the envelope within which they are discussing the cost of welfare. As far as the assurance that I have received on behalf of the group is that our conclusion will form an important part of the debate on welfare, but clearly not on the white paper. So, I mean, it's quite clear that they won't coincide, because the white paper, as you rightly say, is due very shortly. I think we are trying to engage with a wider debate, which the white paper, I presume, also is trying to engage with. What are the possibilities of independence? We have a narrow view about that. What are the possibilities for welfare in independence? So I'm hoping between the publication of our report and any referendum, it will open up the possibilities, and there will be, we had teased out some of the issues and challenges of Scotland having its own welfare and social protection system. Is that?
Yeah, no, I would agree with all that. Before I moved to Essex, I used to work at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, where I ran the team which was responsible for estimating the cost and impact of tax and benefit changes. And I noticed that, you know, that form of rigorous scrutiny from an outside body has not yet moved to Edinburgh. So it's not yet the case that when the SNP or other political parties say this is what we want to do for welfare in Scotland, you haven't got a group which comes out and says, and these are what the costs and benefits and impacts would be. And I sense that, you know, that's missing at the moment. And I would hope that the IFS or a body like it would move into that area, you know, fairly soon. And so even if the government weren't to publish full costs and benefits in a white paper, an outside body might do so. Now, as a group, we don't currently, as an expert working group, we currently don't have the technology to do that. I believe we are looking into it. That is the way. Okay, so we're looking into it for our spring report. But I think what you're getting at is that there is a Scottish debate on welfare policy does need input, does need more tools, does need input from other organisations, and I fully support that.
That's essentially my question, so you did answer it, and thanks very much for that. And you've answered a lot of questions this morning. I've certainly found the responses very helpful, and look forward to seeing your work again and having you back in front of us in the springtime or thereafter in order to discuss what your conclusions are come the end of the second report. But can I thank you on behalf of the committee this morning for the time that you've taken and for answering all of our questions so fully. I appreciate that. Thank you. And that concludes our business this morning. Thanks very much to committee members for their attendance.